Read, riff, rapscalionate. Greats in thought. Seminar 2.
Hello. Hey up. Welcome. We're missing Jakub today. If you haven't noticed, he's carrying a hangover injury from a stag party. So it's going to be a bit different this time because we made a bit of a balls up of the last one. Technically, and I think there was a bit of confusion. What we're up to. The point is, try to do. And what we're trying to do is actually something that's quite simple and straightforward, but has been kind of lost in the ether. So, I've prepared some text, an introduction. I'm Luke, better known and loved as Dickhead, Wanker, Mank Twat. Oxford, I'm a barbarian. In Manchester, back at home, a Southern Fairy sellout. Luke works fine. Joined today with the one and only Hat-Trick Patrick, nimble-footed and sprightly player of yore. Professionally, Dr. Patrick Verge, partner in crime, and together with a kind of gruesome twosome of L'Education Totale. Jakub, who isn't here, he's an artist, very brilliant, and he's also very interested in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and we'll come to that a bit later. But the three of us together, we have an art collective that maybe you'll hear about one day called the Visible Committee. So, introductions over. I hope the sound's better this time. I know it sounds so much like I'm in the tunnel. But the main thing that I heard was that people were a bit confused as to what's going on. And I think there was an expectation of something more like a lecture. Despite my incessant repetition that this is not a podcast. But then considering the reading that we do in our lectures, it would be strange to give lectures on lectures, and perhaps somewhere in the future there would be some people giving lectures on our lectures of someone else's lectures, eventually ending up in some kind of dystopic hall of mirrors, like electoral hall of mirrors. So what I wanted to respond to was this misunderstanding, but I'm grateful for the question from the often direct Dave the Rave Harris, for putting it to me quite bluntly, because it got me thinking. People, they do have a point. I mean, you don't really even have seminars at university anymore. You take the sad and sorry form of a GCSE lesson, or a webinar where there's a presentation followed by a Q&A session. But they bear as much resemblance to the real thing as a red Amazonian frog to a spotted leopard or a sea creature of the deep. So it allowed me to reflect on what we're doing, what's the point, and why you should be asked. To begin with the why, it's a cliche repeated ad infinitum to the point of nausea. We're in something of a cultural nadir at the moment, in art, music, theatre, dance, architecture, literature, thought, philosophy. I mean, you name it. Or quite literally, as Jeremy Deller might put it, swimming in shit. Even music festivals are a shadow of their former selves. The utopic carnival reduced to pretty birds in sparkly costumes and 12 quid a tray vegan food vans. It feels like the end of days, as if we're on a spaceship, which, I mean, I guess, living on a hot rock spinning round a gigantic nuclear fusion reactor we call the sun, in the vast nothingness of space. We are, in a sense, on a spaceship. But all the lights on the dashboard are flashing red. The sirens are blaring. and a calm, effeminate digital voice is saying, warning, warning, warning. But every movement is over sooner or later. Every moment passes. Every kingdom falls. Every civilization collapses. And in the end, we're all dead anyway. I don't think, though, in any case, that this sense of impending doom, meaningless, that we now have everywhere. I mean, we don't just hear it on the news, in conversation at the pub if you can afford a pint. We feel it somewhere in the bones. Something fundamental is going on, and it's not pretty. And nowhere is this sense of imminent death or doom more pronounced than thought, thinking, literature, philosophy, which ultimately are the grounds and foundation of all other forms of culture. And so philosophy, thought, thinking, literature, they do have a kind of premonitory quality. This is why the thinker for a long time, as long as we have records really, thousands of years, has been characterized or confused with the prophet. Great works are always ahead of their time, or untimely, as Nietzsche might put it. Whenever I hear something described as vital, urgent, timely, it seems to me gross, disgusting, petty bourgeois, and the last sight you'll see of me or a guy like Patrick or Jacob is us hot-footing into the distance and turning into dust on the horizon. To read the great works of the 20th century, for example, Jean Baudrillard and his work on simulacra, simulation, the totality of media, information and instant communication that saturates our experience like the noxious gas of war. It was written half a century ago, before the internet, before the general proliferation of the computer and screens, before smartphones, before Facebook, before Instagram, TikTok, Amazon, Zoom, before the scandemic. It's almost like looking into the pensive, the mirrored reflection of memory where Dumbledore shares his thoughts in Harry Potter. These great works, not just no longer produced, but almost abandoned, left to rot, or if their force is inescapable, remade, repurposed, refurbished, bearing only a decorative resemblance to the original, a bare, barren, stripped out and dead. If the present moment, this time right now, it seems strange to me when I look back to these masterpieces that are so premonitory. Is why they're confused with prophecy, and the thinker has always had this kind of odd relationship with prophecy. It seems odd to me that these works that have in a way shaped or formed our present moment and that far exceed it, that we should make sense of this present moment with a bunch of barren, hollowed out, insipid, uninspiring crap that comes from that very moment that sets our teeth on edge, that drives us to madness or despair. Rather than exploring the greats of old, we're quite literally drowning in the ocean of shit that is the present moment that we want to get away from. So this is the first reason or answer to the why of this project. Why this seminar, Greats of Thought. It's to, in our own small way, try to do something about this generalized catastrophe, to get the defibrillators out and give the present moment a jump, a kickstart as it were, by an ironic recourse to the old. This present moment that seems everywhere in the throes of death. and to do so by looking back, like Columbus is of thought, to bring back the past, to raise from the depths these masterpieces of yore and revel in them. Let their beauty and magnificence drip from our tongues. Second reason, related to the first. While exceptionally, in the sense of exception, not acceptance, the empirical phenomena or material forms, cause or reason for this catastrophe of the present. What underlies this sense of imminent collapse and fills to the point of suffocation by saturation the ocean of shit that we swim in. There is a cluster of things that really took hold and got going in the 80s, and which now reach a point of ubiquity approaching totality. They suck the oxygen from the air and rob us of life and vitality. These things might be summed up in the attitude that is most visible in its ordinary form, and you might describe as a kind of grim materialism. We all face it in some way or another every day. It's a sad, mean, nasty, and selfish empiricism. It manifests as an obsession with conspicuous consumption, with things, with personal experience, no matter how barren or banal. And the root cause of this, or the root causes are, at once thoughtlessness, a lack of thinking, and so ignorance, stupidity. And at the same time, for reasons that are fairly obvious, the individualism and selfishness that is the dark twin of thoughtlessness. Thought, reading, is so often mistaken as solipsistic, lonely, as a person unto themselves. But there is no such thing as a private language. You might think in the singular, and your ideas in their complexity, richness, might come from you, but the form of your thought is inescapably public or common in the technical sense. The words you use, their meaning, their grammar is common, is public, is shared. And just think about it. It's one of those things that with a moment's thought is so blindingly obvious, you wonder how the fuck you never realised it before. To read is to listen. It is to be with the words and so be alongside the person who wrote them. A friend of mine, an anthropologist called Matt Weber, he made a similar point. We were having a conversation about his work, kind of taken to extremis. And we were talking about hermitage. And again, he wasn't using the term hermitage in the debased conventional sense of a weird old man living by himself, but in the full and rich sense of its historical religiosity. So what then was a hermit? Sure, they were a person who would go to the far reaches of the earth, to the depths of the forest, the peaks of mountain tops, or even the Arctic tundra, to be alone. But they weren't going to be alone at all. In fact, they were going far away from people and their inane, noisy chatter, far away from the hustle and bustle of the town or city, not to be alone, but to be closer. Closer to who? Well, God, of course. The hermit was he who wanted to escape humanity, come closer to God. It was not an act of loneliness, but a rite, passage, or act of communion. If we're to escape this hell of the present, and if we are to do so by returning ourselves to thoughtfulness, well, it would make no sense to do so alone, without a guide nor God to show us the way. And given that we are no gods, we can only hope to be decent guides. Just another remark before I sum up this second reason. If the hell of the present is rooted in a kind of thoughtlessness, and a kind of thoughtlessness is itself rooted in a grim materialism, what, we might ask, is the most common now, in the conventional contemporary sense, expression of this grim materialism, this sad imperialism? It is, of course, the notion that we're just animals. We are mere blood, flesh and bone, and that's that. The hell of the present, then, is the hell of the animal, living like an animal, living only to eat, drink, work, fuck, or as people in a civilization where survival is very much not a question, unless you live in, say, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan. I laugh with incredulity when someone in England says, you know, how's life going? I'm just surviving. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's the life of an animal. The hell of the present is the hell of the animal. To live like an animal. To live only to eat, drink, work, fuck, survive. And no matter how sumptuous or luxurious it is, a vision of life, it is profoundly unhuman. It's a life in which we are little more than grazing cattle in search of a new field with better sun, greener grass, more trees for shade and fresh running water. There is a beguiling truth to this, of course. We are animals. We do eat and drink and work and survive. And you wouldn't want a more sumptuous material existence. Delicious food, exquisite drink, a beautiful house by the river or sea with vast acres of rich and fertile land. Only a monk, perhaps, wouldn't want these things. But you don't need to get monastic fantastic to see that the problems begin where we begin to live life for these things to the exclusion of all else. We become dumb, lazy, stupid, greedy, thoughtless, but most importantly, we deny our own humanity, what separates us from animals, and which is, after all, and quite simply, our mind, our thought, our consciousness, our language, and so consequently our works. It is these things that separate us from the plants and the animals. And it is these things that the hell of the present denies us in its thoughtlessness. Ducks fall in love just like we do. Some birds mate for life just like we do. Other animals fuck anything that'll give them a go just like we do. Penguins huddle for warmth just like we do. And anyone who has ever had, or is interested in, or loves cats or dogs will know that just like we do, they have emotions and feelings. Just like we do, they have memory, character, and qualities such as empathy, kindness, cruelty, even evil. But, and this is a big fucking but, they could never paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, nor build nor design the structure that supports it. They couldn't compose a symphony, write a book, or invent a religion. There is no cat Bible. Well, I'm sure there are a bunch of cat Bibles, but I hold the bet that none of them are written by cats. It's thought, consciousness, language that separates us from animals. And if animalism then is the most obvious expression of the grim empiricism that founds the hell of the present, it is by returning to, reviving, resuscitating what differentiates us from animals, what makes us human, that we begin the task of building the way out, of seeing the light searing through the now open window to somewhere else, the vitality, life, joy. And if the most fundamental forms of thoughtfulness are literature and philosophy, It is to this that we must turn. Because by turning to thought, literature, and philosophy, we perform an ironic double maneuver. We turn away from ourselves in the same movement that we come into ourselves. And in turning away from ourselves to come into ourselves, we liberate ourselves from this present moment that suffocates us, from the ocean of shit that we swim in, to something far more beautiful. But we must not do so alone, without a guide. Hence, Greats in Thought. Hence, the formula of the seminar. But why not then we do something like this? I mean, something a bit better than this. You know, I wrote this in one take this morning. I didn't practice or really prepare. It's not something really that I want to do. I don't want to sit behind a camera or a microphone or even at a lectern and lecture you. So why then the seminary format? Why the demand for reading? Why, you might ask, can't you just tell us what or how to think and then we can talk about it later? Firstly, because in the state of thoughtlessness and grim materialism that is the bedrock of the hell of the present, the mind is atrophied, and like any muscle needs to be reactivated. It needs to be trained. This is not a podcast, nor a series of lectures, precisely because it is only you that can change your present moment. It is only you that can restore yourself to your common humanity. And it is only you that can do that by bringing yourself to thoughtfulness. Me, Patrick, Jakob, others soon, we hope, to join, useful guides. And at the same time, intensifiers of thoughtfulness. But we can't do it for you. It's why we want more people to join the seminar, to get involved, to be confused, to ask questions, to go in the wrong direction, fall over, trip up. We'll be there to help you up, dust yourself off, give you a lamp in the dark, guide you along the wrong path. But it's only you that can do this. With all the podcasts and lectures that there are in the world, it's going to rat shit and fuck all's changing. Second reason for the seminary format is because it is precisely passivity and laziness that has led to this sorry state of affairs. A nation's politics is an expression of the level of cultivation that permits it, as Emerson might put it. It's no good us sitting here lecturing you whilst you listen, cooking your tea, doing your cleaning, falling asleep. It's not a lecture. It's not a podcast. It's Greats on Thought, seminar for the damned. I mean, we want to lead by example. We want to show the way through our own activity, through our own action. I mean, I've personally already read all 14 years of Foucault's lectures twice over. They were a foundational and important part of my doctoral thesis at Oxford. Yet, I read them again, with you, alongside you, so as not to lecture you, resulting in this kind of dystopic hell of lectoral mirrors. But also because Foucault's lectures and all of the great works that we will go on to consider, I mean, with you or without you, we will be doing this every week, I'm sure, with breaks for the rest of our lives. We'll get on with Foucault, we'll move on to Hobbes, to Hegel, to Hume, to Heidegger, Maybe we'll go to the ancients, to Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, maybe the pre-Socratics, Parmenides and the like. These great works, and I mean that's exclusively philosophy, of course. You know, we could look at literature, we could look at drama, theatre. But great works are not a plane or surface, they are a depth. And on every rereading of Foucault, for example, I discover a new kind of richness. I spot a gem or precious thing, a vein of gold that previously went unnoticed. And what excites me the most about reading them again, a third time, is that I'm just me, with my life, my limits, my experience, my qualities and my flaws. You might spot something that I completely missed, that Patrick had no idea about. Bring a new richness to light. Who knows? Here's looking at you, kid. But we'll lead by example. We'll show you the way. Provide you that sense of community and togetherness, and hope that you see you're not alone, all's not lost, and that, you know, there is a future for you. Only you have the courage to grasp it, grip onto it, take hold of it with both hands and wrestle with it. So there we have it. The why and what of Greats of Thought. Provide a window of hope for the dark hell of the present by turning away from ourselves to our common shared humanity together through the reading and discussion of great works. Not so short. But there's one more question, one of capital importance. Why are we beginning with Foucault's lectures? I mean, he's already a kind of marginal, not marginal in the sense of his importance, significance, popularity. Certainly he is very much despised and excluded. He isn't someone like, you know, Patrick's a master of Shakespeare. We could talk about Milton, Spinoza, I mean even a more contemporary thinker like Malcolm X, James Baldwin. Why specifically Foucault and not something else? Of the thousands of books that I've read and wrestled with, the hundreds that I've fully understood, the few that I have a genuine mastery of, why Foucault's lectures? Well, they have a unique status in the history of thought. It's not like listening to other great scholars who might give lectures on a period, a subject, another great thinker. Taken as a whole and stretching from 1970 to 1984, they represent nothing less than a radical rereading and reinterpretation of Western civilization. To arrive at something almost like an answer as to why does our present moment exist in the way that it does? How has this particular configuration of the world in which we live have come to be? Why are the forms of experience that are possible in our moment possible? In doing so, he takes up an unimaginably broad range of sources, with each lecture series taking a radically different thing as its object of study, considering a different period of time that he considers to be relevant to the thing in question. But on top of that, different kinds of sources, different thinkers, different disciplines. A study of Foucault's lectures is broader, richer, and more satisfying than any degree, most of which these days, unless they teach some kind of techniques or methodology, are not just worthless, but useless. If you don't believe me, use Psychiatric Power as exemplary. Just look at the contents. Look at the themes at the beginning of each lecture and the terrain covered. This is one series of lectures. Incredible. Second reason for Foucault is just the quality of his reading, the sheer force of his analysis, the insurrectionary character of his insights. You could spend a lifetime studying Descartes, his Hugo Kogito-san, for example. Many have. Many have quite literally spent lifetimes. And you could learn more from reading 30 pages of Foucault than people have learned in entire lifetimes. I remember how awestruck that I was at supposedly the best universities in the world, taught by supposedly the greatest professors, paid and being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds. I read Descartes. I was giving lectures on Descartes. I went to seminars on Descartes. I spent probably more than 100 hours trying to work him out. And for all that effort, I could have just read 20 or 30 pages of Foucault. Third reason, these are after all lectures given for free and open to the public at the Collège de France. They are theatrical and seductive by design. His actual works can be almost impenetrably difficult to understand, even for the most advanced thinkers. And I'll say it and sound like a twat, because I'm a twat. What I'll say is that I'm probably one of less than 10 or 20 people in the world who truly understand Foucault's work. By his own prophecy, I'm in a sense his heir. And I am still very much the keeper of his secret. Yet it's not to his major works that I turn to understand his thought, or the questions, domains, periods that motivate them. It's his lectures. And he didn't even write them down. We're lucky to have them today because many a keen student used recording devices to capture them. They are a gift. And a gift is always something for sharing. Finally, and somewhat ironically, Foucault hated lecturing. He hated his fame. He hated his notoriety. He hated what he calls in France the group effect. What he really wanted to lead was seminars. Seminars where people pick up problems, pick up questions, and get to work together. As the bearer then of his secret and truth, I feel obliged to begin the fulfillment of that dream, the dream of a Parisian seminar, greats in thought, with his work. Well, that was quite an introduction. See what Patrick has to say. Or maybe not.
Washing machine was pissing me off with the whole of that speech. No, I was going to read out that excerpt from the passage, like in the foreword to Psychiatric Power. But actually, I want to say one thing first of all, just to pick up on, obviously the enormous, almost contagious popularity of these kind of pseudo-intellectual podcasts, And I think that everyone who finds themselves, just think about how many people actually go out for a jog, or for their sort of obligatory walk through nature, and see as part of a therapy they're trying to perform on themselves, the necessity of some kind of intellectual podcast. And I think a lot of these people are kind of intelligent, semi-educated university graduates that are suffering, and no doubt they're yearning for culture. They're kind of craving it. They're hungry for culture, and they're suffering from a mixture of feelings. On the one hand, a sort of intellectual malnutrition, and deprivation. On the other hand, a feeling of guilt, basically, having sort of abandoned intellectual studies. And so what they do, and I think it's kind of dangerous, almost at the level of a sort of addiction, they put on a sort of the philosophical equivalent of, a virtual reality headset. And they experience for a short period of time, almost cerebral vibrations, chemical vibrations in the brain, which sort of simulate thought. Okay. So they place the thoughts of someone else, like a sort of cassette player, implanted and slotted into their brains that gives them a momentary feeling of jouissance, a momentary frisson of understanding. And for, you know, an hour or half an hour, maybe longer, maybe there's an afterglow, when the podcast is over. But nonetheless, for a very limited period of time, they feel connected back up to the intellectual education they abandoned. They feel momentarily fed, They're able to escape their state of malnutrition and deprivation. And I feel like, well, that obviously doesn't work, You have to keep going back again and again. The thoughts that someone, else has sort of like cooked up and been able to squeeze and compact into a single like 30-minute blast, they're not actually the thing these people are after. And I don't know, like, what they really want, I think, is an extended period of collaborative study in the company of like experts or guides, but also being immersed in something that has a kind of like true richness, a multi-dimensional richness, like the lecture series of Foucault. And so I just think that it's almost like that. I don't know who these people are, but there should be a certain amount of skepticism towards, their own feelings of hunger, what form they've ended up taking, like why they need to be squeezed into a half an hour session where there's, at the end of which they go home with a kind of party bag of insights, a sort of like, a menu of different things that they've learned. And why that provides this momentary feeling, this momentary sort of hit or fix, or, it's like simulated bliss of understanding. And I think, like, it's just important to mention that we've seen that doesn't work, and it's kind of damaging, mutilates the soul, mutilates the psyche. And that's why we're trying to provide this alternative context, this alternative space where a kind of disciplined thoughtfulness is going to be encouraged, nurtured, cultivated, amongst anyone who steps in and, comes to avail themselves of our hospitality.
Yeah, I mean, I think something to say about that is, when I was ill recently, had a bit of a deep dive into this, not just the culture of the podcast, but these pseudo-intellectual videos on YouTube have millions and millions of views, and there's kind of this masochistic homology as to the topics that's related to a pathologization of I think precisely the tension that I didn't identify as one, but there is a tension between the fact that we are animals in one sense. We eat, we drink, we shit, we fuck, we become ill, we become angry. But then at the same time, we have consciousness, we have language. And I think rather than facing up to that tension, rather than grappling with it, people engage with it as you see most people engage at an art gallery. They kind of stroll by the works. I mean, we as artists are very fortunate. We have a certain level of access that is denied to the general public. For example, we wanted to go and look at The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. We wouldn't have to go to the Museo del Prado and have these hordes of tourists kind of, skirtling by this incredibly rich masterpiece, triptych. I mean, I can quickly bring it up as an example. Most people don't have that, and I think it speaks to this sense of there's there's an obligation almost, or compulsion to engage with these forms, but it's fulfilled kind of dolefully in a way that's lulling. And what I meant by the masochistic homology is that this then becomes almost like a mutant hybrid. I was watching a lot of these videos about narcissism, for example, and the first thing that struck me about these videos on narcissism is that they're essentially a pathologization of the difficulty and complexity of human relationships. So most of the traits that are listed, so I'll provide just one. So the narcissist is someone who criticizes your friends. Well, what if your friends are dickheads? It kind of begins and ends at an injunction, as you say, a menu, like a takeaway list of insight. Baudrillard has this notion of Eurydicean notions, right? The story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So Eurydice is sent to the underworld. Orpheus makes a deal with Hades, the master of the underworld, and he says, well, Orpheus, you can have Eurydice back, but the road back to, or the ladder back to the normal world is long. The only rule is that you cannot look back. The moment that you look back to Eurydice, I will snatch her and take her, and she will remain forever in the underworld. And of course, Orpheus at some point becomes nervous, worried. He looks back, Hades snatches her. So a Eurydicean notion is one that, upon any form of examination, it disappears. And the homologous masochism is because, of course, it might be the trait of what we, in the conventional sense, in the contemporary sense, the debased sense, call narcissism. An attempt to separate one from one's friends, but someone's friends can be extremely damaging, virulent, violent, dangerous. It can be an act of great mercy or kindness to try and separate one from one's friends. So and that's what I mean by the kind of homology, the way in which the things are kind of layered on top of each other. And it's masochistic because you end up just in this realm of verbal kung fu. There's no insight or analysis or examination or investigation. It's just the use of these words that are literally used like swords or bows and arrows. They're used to wound, to injure, to kill. And the other thing I found quite ironic about the whole thing, this whole discourse of narcissism is, it's huge. There are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of views, and these kind of coaches who go around teaching people about how to spot a narcissist and how to spot a psychopath. And I could take their tableau, their criteria, and pretty much everyone that I've met in my entire life, I could say is a narcissist.
Yeah.
And so that's why it becomes
sort of horoscopic quality to some of these analyses.
Yeah, it becomes kind of masochistic. It's like an act of self-harm, because all you end up doing is tearing apart the fabric of your social life, or reducing that to such a level of banality that it's almost not worth living. The other interesting thing is that the story of narcissism itself, because of my background, I had a very, very not just reverse snobbishness, but like an attitude of outright hostility to the classics and the classical texts. And when I won the scholarship to Oxford, I became very good friends with a quite brilliant thinker called Jack, and he was a classicist, a studier of the ancient text, and he was just like, Luke, shut the fuck up. Here's a copy of The Clouds by Aristophanes. For those who don't know him, he was an ancient Greek comedian. And I read it and I was just overwhelmed, overjoyed. Found it brilliant, magnificent, fantastic, hilarious. And again, it links to this idea I have of the kind of lolling drawl, almost kind of like doleful reading of culture in the form of a podcast, which, like I say, is like the way that people stroll through an art gallery.
I think that's interesting, though.
It kind of robs us of richness, vitality, and life.
Yeah. I mean, just to add something to what you were saying earlier on about, like, what is the point in these, like, dissections, analyses, theorizations of narcissism? Well, because they kind of validate and underwrite your use of the term narcissist, which is fundamentally an insult, really. Yeah, it's a sort of, as you said already yourself, in a slightly different way, it's a kind of weapon, something that you can use against people. But what does the weapon, a kind of a verbal taser, really? And what does the weapon allow you to do? Well, the weapon allows you even to riff on your old ideas of, what's it called again? Discursive resistance, yeah, and the disqualificatory utterance. It disqualifies the speaker. So if you're a narcissist, I don't have to take anything you say seriously. Yeah, I read and map everything that you say back onto your narcissism, and it becomes false, windy, hollow. It becomes Machiavellian, some like attempt to deceive me. And so what these people, these kind of like gurus of narcissism are doing is they're giving people basically a set of equipment which will allow them to silence others, stop them from speaking, and to, because of that, entrench themselves into a kind of a really sad, pathetic, depressing solipsism. Solipsism being like the fact that I'm alone on this planet. I live in my own little pod. I kind of like I'm just a monad. Floating in a kind of vacuum. And I think what was I going to say? Yeah. So think about what an ordinary podcast is doing with words. It gives you words so you can silence others, like disarm them, take away their voice. Now, what I feel we're trying to do here is to inherit a vocabulary, that will make from a world-class thinker like Foucault, inherit a vocabulary, inherit a language, a foreign language, a language it's going to take some time to learn and acclimatize ourselves to, and sort of become masters in. But the aim is to inherit this language, not so as to be able to silence others, but so as to just be able to increase your range of expressivity, to make your own thinking and thoughts more sophisticated, to kind of make your visions more kind of radiant, plump. And so that then when you go out into the world amongst others, you'll be able to harvest everything you've learned here in the form of gifts given to other people, not in the form of weapons to shut them down, not in the form of one-liners to make them look stupid, not by trapping them in a kind of really small-minded discourse, but by, sort of, not to sound like too religious or, mystical about it, by being sort of missionaries, by spreading a kind of enlightenment. And I think there's so even at the level, there's something, I don't know exactly how to explain it, but there's something important happening here in the way in which we're trying to overturn the relationship between thought and language that seems to be perpetuated, and have ossified in and through these podcasts. Right? it's like what, maybe we can move on a little bit. It's like what we were saying earlier, Luke, about how Foucault uses words in general. Okay. So like a classic analytic way of introducing a philosophical concept would be by fixing a word, let's say a word like power, or a word like sovereignty, or a word like individual, fixing it to a certain definition. In fact, impaling it on a definition, and then exemplifying a strictly limited set of possible uses of this word. Like that, that's a kind of classic analytic way of beginning a philosophical essay. Now, what Foucault does is, it's kind of hard for me to express, but it's almost like he thinks, what can I do with this word? Okay, how can I play with this word? How can I like deploy, apply, and utilize this word in such a way as to be able to, open up space for thought, or to be able to cut into our prejudices, or to be able to cause a kind of outbreak of enlightenment. So, when I was talking to you before, I was saying that it's almost like words themselves are used in this speculative way in the lectures of Foucault and in his other works too. It's as if he's always speaking in the subjunctive, like not in the indicative where he says that this is how things are, and not in the conditional, if something is like this, then it must be like that, but in the subjunctive, in the mood of hope, in the mood of speculation, in the mood of desire, And I remember there's a kind of like French poet and artist who says that for him, like drawing had this like essentially improvisatory quality, and he called it taking a line for a walk. And so in some way I think that thinking, like again with all like necessary qualifications put to the side, thinking in Foucault is a bit like taking a concept for a walk, taking an idea for a stroll, seeing how far you get with it. So then when he comes back next week and does something else with this concept, he's not contradicting himself. He hasn't lost heart. He's not completely abandoned his old use of the term. What he's doing is he's like, you know what, guys, I found this new thing we can do with this word. Do you want to have a look? Like there's something kind of like essentially, it's like I don't know how to put it, but a constitutive irony in his use of word, a légèreté, like a light touch, in his use of language. So that he's the kind of perfect thinker, with respect to what I just said a second ago, for us to inherit a language from. Because this is a language in embryonic form, in its beginnings, a language which is absolutely unfixed. So that, just as you said earlier, Luke, like someone could kind of wrong foot you, dumbfound you, leave you gobsmacked by finding something in a text you think you know inside out that you'd never seen before. Okay, surprising you by showing you, look at this. But did you think of that? And that's kind of what we want here. At the same time, it's almost like, well, someone could come along, absorb, inherit one of these words, and do something surprising, wonderful with it that we would never have thought of. And that I think that's part of like, I don't know what to put it, but it's like it's this exercise in and through of thinking in and through language with a certain set of words that function like a different form of equipment, a parasque, how do you say that word, parasque? And that provide us with
Equipment.
like a series of equipment or intellectual exercises to go through. And I don't know, I think that's another reason why it's good to begin here.
Yeah.
And it makes like
No, I was just gonna say, to be
trying out a
animalistic,
word, essaying a word,
to be animalistic, we're gonna have to go for a piss in a
Oh,
second. But there's that passage, and then maybe we
shall I
can
read the passage
resume.
now?
Well, yeah, when I pop out quickly, but I just wanted to say that the interesting thing about your extension of this notion of verbal kung fu or discursive resistance. So, like I brought up the deep dive of YouTube and narcissism and the kind of homological masochism of it, and how it results in a kind of solipsism, turning in on the self. That links to how I was trying to articulate, the seminar for the damned as an escape from the hell of the present. The hell of the present being a hell of thoughtlessness, and thought being intimately entwined with language. And the reason why this is really fascinating in the context of Narcissus is because the myth of Narcissus, of course, comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And the story of Narcissus is actually embedded within the broader story of Echo. So who is Echo? Well, Echo was a nymph or sprite, or some kind of semi-divine being, part human, part god. And she was renowned for her use of words, for her ability to enrapture or encapture the gods in and through her discourse. And she saves a load of her fellow women from rape by Zeus, I think. Either that or Zeus fucks her and Hera, the wife of Zeus, becomes jealous. In any case, before we meet Narcissus, we meet Echo. And Echo is quite literally where the modern word comes from. Echo, 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 echo. Echo's curse, her curse from the gods, as punishment for trickery in and through speech, is that she is condemned to only be able to repeat the last words that someone said back to them. So this figure of Narcissus, who is now transformed into precisely, a kind of a form of self-validation. I don't know, there's something both ironic and complex. And it's unthought and unspoken here, right? Because Echo is wandering through the forest, and she sees Narcissus, and this is the first time that Narcissus appears in ancient Greek mythology. It's in the context of the story of Echo. And Echo, of course, falls in love with Narcissus. But because she can only repeat back to him what he says, he thinks her mad and kind of runs away. And it's Echo then is the kind of spark, because it's returning to the spot where, out of kind of curiosity, I guess, where he was beseeched by Echo that Narcissus approaches the famous pool. The pool, of course, in which he gazes at himself, falls in love with himself, and therefore becomes narcissistic. I don't know. I mean, we could probably have a whole entire seminar series on this conjuncture, but there's something really interesting going on here. And I find it interesting that, Narcissus loses his relationship of power over himself to conduct himself. He loses himself to self-love, precisely in and through the return to the beseechment of someone cursed in and through her powers of trickery. Those powers of trickery now attributed to the narcissist. Anyway, I'll leave you with that one for a second.
All right, one sec. I'll read when you come back, okay? Because
Yeah. You see this while Patrick is gone, and I think if we hadn't made it clear, we don't want the seminar or the group to be me, Patrick, Jakob, another specialist or thinker. We want it to be a seminar. People who are engaged, thoughtful, of people who would
Yeah, what I
ask
think is interesting
questions.
about.
So
Yeah,
sorry,
sorry.
I was just saying in your absence that just to kind of emphasize the point while you were gone, that really we don't just want me, you, Jakob, even more specialists.
Hmm.
It's more to have hopefully a group of people who are precisely non-specialists, who can question, interrupt, rebut, carry the torch at times. And I just thought it
Yeah.
was funny that kind of moment of silence of us both having to leave.
Yeah.
Whereas if we were 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, probably maximum, the kind of loss of an individual becomes much less. Which is also, again, it's kind of the point, right? You turn away from oneself to reconstitute oneself in a common form of humanity that has certainly been lost, and increasingly so.
Yeah, no, yeah. What was I got? Just to comment quickly, like, and kind of on the tale of Narcissus and Echo that you just recounted, and it struck me that, like, there's something obviously, like, kind of immortal about some of these myths, but there's a sort of, like, because, like, they seem to be so, like, resonant and evocative, and there's something that weird that happens to the thoughts, like, all my thoughts start whizzing. But in a weird way, they're also tantalizingly provisional. Like, they're almost like deliberately incomplete. So it's almost like they have this ability to reincarnate themselves for each new generation. Because I already thought, like, whilst you were telling the story, I could see your thoughts hovering over a certain interpretation of the myth. And I started thinking about a different one. I started to think that, like, what becomes like the cause and impetus for Narcissus' turn to narcissism is precisely the failure of that interaction with Echo. So Echo used to be someone with a kind of lyricism, loquacity, charm, and like verbal mastery. It's not just in the form of trickery, enchantment, and being a sort of trickster towards the gods, but also in the form of being a ravishing speaker, and therefore having to have gained mastery over discourse and over language, right. Narcissus then comes to the woods. He meets someone with whom he might have had this moment of, like, fulfilling, erudite, beautiful conversation, but finds only an echo, you know. So finds basically conversation itself degraded, conversation itself derelict, dilapidated, and then turns inward, in this sort of, like, solipsistic spiral, and becomes, the first narcissist. That's what I was thinking.
It's
Because
interesting because a friend of ours who I won't name, but you'll know who I'm talking about. Um, I think a lot of his struggle in life is because he sees himself, because he is often, sometimes, brilliant in insight or remarks or analysis, but he almost brings them as gifts, as these things that are to be kind of savored delectably and appreciated by people not in a way that they then kind of build upon, redouble, transfigure, transform, elevate, refine, but rather just consume. And it was just, you know, when you were speaking, then you just made me think of that modality of intellect or thought or speech or insight, which is, in, you know, of itself a kind of curse, or at least a malady, you know, something to be cured and gotten away from. And I mean, it always struck me in the context of some of his resentments that it's precisely because it's funny, I think apart from a couple of times, maybe in France, you know, our relationship has always been very much dualistic, you know, and non-communal. But you've kind of stated this yourself in the context of being frustrated in conversations where you're trying to tantalize or intrigue or seduce someone into a line or mode of thinking that you think is both, you know, a gift, is both something that's delectable and delicious, and that they would enjoy, but it's also something that you want them to take on themselves and to, you know, to do something with, like you said, you know, to take the word along the line. Or I don't know, I always just, you know, think of this cliche in jazz, you know, hey there, brother, take that bass line for a walk. And kind of that like, you know, the walk of the bass, you know, it almost becomes the rhythm of the fugue of jazz.
Yeah. Because the alternative is, and as I've described to you many times before, is that the intellectual gets then turned into a sort of monkey entertainer, you know, almost like a kind of walking freak show. So you get rolled out at opportune moments by, like, you know, the mate that for this moment in time functions as the master of the revels, or the sort of like, what's the guy who introduced the ringmaster? That's it. Introduces the circus.
Yeah.
And he's like, look at this guy, you know, he's a philosopher, you know, and he's like, he goes behind me and kind of winds me up, you know, what subject would you like him to talk on? And then it's like, okay, and then he like whispers in my ear, you know, then I talk for ages and everyone's like, oh yeah, well done, you know, this is exactly the thing you don't want to happen, you know, this is it, because it screens you off inside a sort of, and screens you off and strands you inside of an empty theatricality. So you just become, even if you're literally physically in front of someone, in proximity to them, in the bar, and with all the kind of intimacy and friendliness and like warm bodily warmth that involves, still you become almost something they've just flicked on the television or on their phone, you know, like a momentary bit of entertainment, something to pass the time with.
Yeah. So something that can also be kind of, you know, almost like a, I don't know why my mind goes to like VHS or a tape. You know, you can kind of press play and then press pause.
There
You
you
know,
go.
it's
Yeah.
like you have your moment. I think I go to VHS and tapes. You know, because of that really rich and beautiful culture of romance and love that used to surround the tape. You know, making someone that you love the tape, right? Often you wouldn't even have the songs, so you'd be waiting on the radio. So you'd have the songs that you wanted, the order
The
in which you
mixtape.
wanted them to be played, and then you'd be waiting, you know, on the radio for the song to come on. You'd be like, all right, you know, hit record, and then hit stop. then hit record, and then hit stop, and then hit record, and then hit stop. But that record and stop kind of took place as part of a larger, greater, grander, richer, and more beautiful dance. And just to mention something, what you were saying, it reminded me of it's one of my favourite books. Listen, Little Man by Wilhelm Reich. For anyone who doesn't know Reich, your life, your subjectivity, your experience, your existence would not be the way it is without Wilhelm Reich. So for anyone who says to you, let your emotions out, set yourself free, this was Reich. This was Wilhelm Reich. The idea before Reich came from Freud. So Freud's idea in Civilization is discontent. So again, it plays upon this contradiction of our kind of animalistic nature, our emotions, our fears, our desires, and then the demands of civilization. And then the mad, the discontented, are the people who are maladjusted, who cannot form some kind of balance between these competing demands. So the answer for Freudian psychotherapy, Freudian psychoanalysis, is then to, in some way, repress those animalistic desires. And that's where the concept of sublimation comes from. So to sublimate is to take the kind of raw and earthly energy of the animal and transfigure that into the artistic. So like, I'm sure in literary criticism, Freudian reading of work would be one in which the genius is somehow comes from some initial or ongoing act of repression that's then transfigured into something sublime. Whereas Reich completely inverts that schema, and he says, no, we have to unleash, we have to get red. It's precisely the containment and the constriction that drives us insane. And Reich's ideas were, in a very important sense, a driver of the sexual revolution. So, now, hookup culture and casual dating, and it's reached a point of banality that's almost, it's just exhausting now. In the 80s, it was interesting to be kinky. Now it's kind of like expected, Like I was watching this video of a rave recently, and it was the artist Jeremy Deller, and he was presenting as a counterpoint a moment of transformation of British culture, and it was this show where they would go to concerts. In the first concert, it's kind of people like in suits dancing and having fun, and they're very much in control of the situation. And in the second one, they're in a warehouse, it's illegal, they're sweating, and they've completely lost control of this situation. But the kind of to bring it, all the way back to your point about genius and its presentation. And we don't even have to use a word as kind of leaden and weighted and heavy as genius. We could just say delightful thought. Reich uses the notion of genius, and he says, we love our genius. Society wants its genius, but it wants its clean-shaven genius, well-heeled, the kind of genius that you can parade down the streets without embarrassment. And it just speaks to me of this notion, of the kind of the pause button. It's like they bring you out, as ringmaster, they get you to perform your trick of genius, but it remains in a box, remains contained. It's not allowed to become promiscuous, to become viral, to transmute or interact with other things that you might consider sacred or orderly, in a fashion that must not be disturbed.
Yeah, but it's like one of those crazes that like used to sweep the world, like in the 19th century, when all the bourgeoisie would have like a certain kind of like pet that was in that year. Like one year it might be a chihuahua, the next year it might be a monkey. Third year everyone's walking around with a parrot. And I get the sense that, like, as someone that thinks, sometimes you're considered one of these exotic pets, So you go out one night and there's a kind of like, there's a rage for philosophers, So everyone wants to sit you down, prove to you they know a little bit about Nietzsche and Socrates. And you're kind of like, number one invitee, number one guest, And then the next week you go out and you try to talk again, and everyone's like, what, are you still into that philosophy thing? That that was last week, And it's like fashion doesn't like quite sum it up, it's not about that. It's something deeper than that. It's the kind of like we've lost the inability to do anything more than sample things, to have a sort of little lick, a little sniff at everything. And I think that goes with, like those like restaurants where you just get like loads and loads of tiny little dishes, for people that just can't make their mind up and have hours to waste on like just receiving nourishment, and alimenting themselves. Uh, and I don't want to be a little, bit of cream in a dish,
Yeah, yeah.
or a pet
No,
that's walked
yeah,
around, because I think philosophy is something it's like, even the word philosophy actually almost does that in itself. Like that's why thinking, is something that's so pervasive and ubiquitous. Like you could never do without it, really. It's everywhere and always. And that's like, I don't know, and it seems to me that earlier on we were talking about, fuck, how was I trying to wed this in? Yeah, yeah. So earlier on we were talking about this idea of, the way in which narcissism is analysed and discussed and theorised, and how what you get out of it is you get this set of like criteria by which you can silence or render voiceless another person. Now, almost like without the need for that, like, why does that exist? Well, maybe because just the opposite of the person you described, let's say the rambunctious philosopher, the anarchic philosopher, the philosopher who has a new way of like, you know, breaking into other people's lives every day, who has a kind of a mastery both of like rarefied thought and erudition, but also of like, trash tactics of sabotage and gate crashing, Like, think about Diogenes used as one of his philosophical stunts, used to wank in the marketplace. I mean, and it's not just like, it's not just a thing. Oh yeah, he was a kind of slob and he was grotesque and that's cool. No, no, it's like that was part of, a whole mise en scène, a whole piece of philosophical stagecraft. So the idea was he'd be wanking in front of these like middle class people of ancient Greece or whatever the equivalents, and they'd be kind of revolted, disgusted. They'd throw stuff at him, they'd curse him, they'd spit on him. But eventually, someone would ask, "Why are you masturbating? What are you doing?" And he turned around and said, "If only we can get rid of hunger. If only we could get rid of hunger by rubbing our belly." You know? And for me, that was the point. They're together. They're an ensemble. It's a philosophical stunt that's supposed to be like, well, I don't know how the ultimate reading of this, but that there's something like festive about this moment of public masturbation, because it comes with this other thing of like, we're kind of these vulnerable, fragile creatures, and we have, like, for Diogenes, like the whole point of cynicism was we have these basic needs that, either we neglect, or worse, we turn into something. We kind of do another kind of sublimation. We chase, we slave away at work all day so that we can buy honey cakes that we don't need. But actually, we need a more basic nourishment. Anyway, whatever the kind of like philosophical idea or vision he's trying to, you know, uh, ambush people with here, I think like you can see in Diogenes' behavior a mastery of stagecraft, a mastery of dramaturgy that is, how should I put it, an essential part of what it is to do philosophy. The ability to play a prank, the ability to get up to a kind of mischief, the ability to be able to weather and manipulate vulgar forms for your own advantage. Um, and so, sorry, just to go back to what I was saying before. Um, Shit, what was the thing I was saying before? Oh, yeah, the pet, the philosopher. Uh, Yeah, that's we can end there. That's fine. Yeah, I said everything I wanted to say.
No,
Oh yeah, no, sorry. The thing about thinking, yeah. So that like when when someone wants to the narcissism thing about thinking, yeah, when someone wants to contain you within a particular like peaceable, manicured, neat and tidy version of the philosopher, they're actually already doing something similar to what the person who just listened to the podcast on narcissism gets to do. They're performing a similar act of silencing, a similar act of rending voiceless, of like, of of robbing you of your own your own speech, your own discourse. And like it's going to be hard, but it's time like for philosophy to break out of that condition of like obligatory compulsory silence. Uh, I don't know. It's been engineered from a variety of angles, but I'll finish there.
no, it's actually a good way to bring us back to the why of Foucault, and specifically the why I didn't just
Mm.
choose Foucault's lectures. I chose Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique, the Psychiatric Power. I did so for a specific reason, um, and that's because the works with which, I mean, the ideas of Foucault are now so commonplace. They're part of the normal and everyday.
Mm.
Um, Foucault's insurrectionary notion of power is now very commonplace. So the idea that behind a notion like justice lurks some maleficent intent, the idea that behind the healer lurks someone who in fact wants to gain from you, profit from you, wound you. The time when he was writing in the 60s and the 70s, these were quite literally heretical ideas. And though they are still in the kind of mainstream, heretical, as we saw in the scandemic, and how people behaved in and around COVID, the the exponential and viral outburst of the kind things like the manosphere, things like Twitter now become the unmysterious X. um and I think the best place to start Foucault is with his notion of power. Now most people's engagement with Foucault's notion of power is actually in the culmination of this this is just the first. We'll look at psychiatric power. The next lectures on the abnormal, and I think after the lectures on the abnormal, it's society must be defended, and then after society must be defended comes discipline and punish. And before, because the publication of these lectures is actually quite recent. Before the publication of these lectures, the main primary and first engagement that people would have with Foucault would be through discipline and punish, where he articulates precisely this notion that and this is what he begins to articulate in the third lecture. He begins to consider this notion of pillar power, of a power that does not come from the top, a power that permeates, and in a sense constitutes and shapes the social field, and then it makes all of these very important maneuvers, vis-a-vis science, for example, and that's exactly the point that he's making in Psychiatric Power, in regards to King George the Mad. The point he makes is that there is not firstly and primarily a madness that is then diagnosed and requires restraint, i.e., it is not madness that precedes and justifies the relationship of power. Rather, it is the particular configuration or relationship of power that constitutes the very object that then kind of posthumously justifies its very inception. And I bring this up because this notion of Diogenes masturbating in the street is a certain kind of stagecraft, right? Which leads you to somewhere or to a destination. And in as much as by following Foucault's lectures we're kind of doing the same thing, I thought it'd be a good moment just to read what would have been before the publication of these lectures. And we're talking about only in the last kind of 10 or 15 years the first encounter and engagement with Foucault, which is of course the opening of Discipline and Punish. So I'll just read that quickly, because I think in a very different way he is doing something very similar to what Diogenes does. There is a lot to be said to this. It's incredibly rich, but it has a very similar effect of kind of shock and awe. So, part 1, torture. Chapter 1, the body of the condemned. On the 2nd of March 1757, Damien, the regicide, was condemned to make the amende honorable before the main door of the Church of Paris, where he was to be taken and conveyed in a cart wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax weighing 2 pounds. Then, in the said cart, to the Place de Grève, where, on a scaffold that will be erected there, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers, his right hand holding the knife with which he committed the said parricide, burnt with sulphur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away, poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax and sulphur melted together, and then his body drawn and quartered by 4 horses, and his limbs and body consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the winds. And I'll just continue for a little bit. Finally, he was quartered, recounts the Gazette d'Amsterdam of the 1st of April 1757. This last operation was very long, because the horses used were not accustomed to drawing. Consequently, instead of 4, 6 were needed, and when that did not suffice, they were forced, in order to cut off the wretch's thighs, to sever the sinews and hack at the joints. It is said that though he was always a great swearer, no blasphemy escaped his lips, but the excessive pain made him utter horrible cries, and he often repeated, "My God, have pity on me. Jesus, help me." The spectators were all edified by the solicitude of the parish priest of St. Paul's, who, despite his great age, did not spare himself in offering consolation to the patient. And I'll just continue. Bouton, an officer of the watch, left us his account. The sulphur was lit, but the flame was so poor that only the top skin of the hand was burnt, and that only slightly. Then the executioner, his sleeves rolled up, took the steel pincers, which had been especially made for the occasion, and which were about 1.5 feet long, and pulled first at the calf of the right leg, then at the thigh, and from there at the 2 fleshy parts of the right arm, then at the breasts. Though a strong, sturdy fellow, this executioner found it so difficult to tear away the pieces of flesh that he set about the same spot 2 or 3 times, twisting the pincers as he did so, and what he took away formed each part a wound about the size of a 6-pound crown piece. After these tearings with the pincers, Damien, who cried out profusely, though without swearing, raised his head and looked at himself. The same executioner dipped an iron spoon in the pot containing the boiling potion, which he had poured liberally over each wound. I'll just skip slightly. He cried out, "Pardon, my God, pardon, Lord." Despite all this pain, he raised his head from time to time and looked at himself boldly. The cords had been tied so tightly by the men who pulled the ends that they caused him indescribable pain. Monsieur le Breton went up to him again and asked him if he had anything to say. He said no. Several confessors went up to him and spoke to him at length. He willingly kissed the crucifix that was held out to him. He opened his lips and repeated, "Pardon, Lord." The horses tugged hard, each pulling straight on a limb. After a quarter of an hour, the same ceremony was repeated, and finally, after several attempts, the direction of the horses had to be changed thus. Those at the arms were made to pull towards the head, those at the thighs towards the arms, which broke the arms at the joints. And this was repeated several times without success. He raised his head and looked at himself. 2 more horses had to be added, and to those harnessed to the thighs, which made 6 horses in all, without success. And it continues, and becomes more graphic and more vulgar, and more detailed every time, before being all of a sudden set against this sequence of rules.
Yeah, do you want to say something about that in terms of what you just mentioned a second ago? It kind of speaks for itself, but
Well, the number of things to be said about it that haven't been said and that are quite remarkable and quite fascinating. I think the most important one is that there's a certain displacement that goes on here because the theatricality does not come from Foucault himself. If you notice, Foucault only inserts himself as curator. The first segment comes from Pièce Originale, which is essentially a collection of newspapers. It's a forecast. It's a newspaper that's saying this execution is going to happen. And then the Gazette de Amsterdam, which then recounts the actual execution. Well, that would be one of these, kind of compilations of newspaper articles that would be published at the end of the year.
Mm.
And so again, Foucault only inserts himself here as a kind of curator, which is interesting in respect of, what we're trying to do. And just to further, make the point, it's, thirdly, it's Bouton, an officer of the watch, left us his account. So then he moves again to another text and kind of inserts himself as a curator, as almost a leader or a guide. And I think, in a sense, that's what we're trying to do with this project, is to, we are beginning with Foucault precisely for some of the reasons that I articulated at the very start, because he is already, the kind of greatest curator, the finest guide, the most sophisticated and insurrectionary reader. So where else to go and where else to begin? But then as we continue, the names that I mentioned are not names that anyone unfamiliar with philosophy would be unfamiliar with. And certainly everyone knows Shakespeare.
Yeah. We'll go swimming with the wall. I was going to say one thing about that though, like that opening there. There is this weird difference though between, I think, in some sense, how should I put this? There's an awe and fascination with this moment in Foucault. He's kind of like the quoting savors these moments. Now, just exactly what is savored. Well, I think on the one hand, like these are things that like are kind of in the air when people talk about Foucault. but there is a love of the publicity, the availability of this moment. Okay, and everything that comes with that. For example, that things don't work out quite right. The pincers take ages to work. The lamp doesn't light properly, and so it doesn't burn his flesh. The it takes the horses a very, very long time, like, to do their work. And so there are all these series of mishaps, accidents, which now in the society in which we live are kind of like sealed over, or at least screened out, screened off. So on the one hand, we have the publicity and the ostentation of this execution. Whereas in our time we don't have that. Even like snuff videos are kind of taboo, aren't they? And they're up there with like almost like pedophilic images as something that you should absolutely never watch, and never show anybody. But really, they're kind of pale versions of execution compared to this one. Then we also have the idea that, okay, it's a public spectacle in terms of visibility. Everyone's there watching, witnessing, but also in terms of like its recycling and mediation through the news and newspapers. So people are also reading about it, thinking about it, which again I think is interesting. Just being obliged to describe the officer in charge being obliged to describe it, give his account. So there's a sense in which people are participating in the punishment of the individuals of their city, in a really like fulsome, dedicated fashion. So almost like everyone's got blood on their hands and everyone's got like blood in their mind as well. Whereas again, I think one of the things like to which Foucault is most hostile is this idea of like, the sterilization of punishment, for example, the sterilization of discipline in our time. Like even if you just think, because Foucault famously, lover of sadomasochism. So there are moments where he gets kind of giddy in the middle of his texts. There's this almost like a kind of like, you can kind of hear his voice become higher or something. Like in one of the lectures we read for this week, he talks about the amazing instruments that they use in asylums, like the straitjacket or the chair, for example, that punishes you for being restless. And you start, if you get too restless, it whizzes about the place. But if you manage to remain immaculately still, it's just a chair. Or the other thing, the finger glove jacket that pins your palms to your thighs and so on, and increases in its constrictedness whenever you move. Now, so again, so there's a kind of fascination with these sadomasochistic objects and the instruments, but what I think Foucault likes about likes, I don't know, it's not the right word, but feels a certain awe of, or feels a certain like it's almost like reverence for in these objects of punishment, is that they are explicitly, openly, and ostentatiously what they are. You've got red hot pincers that like rip someone's flesh off, and you've got the exact size, of flesh that's taken off, yeah. Whereas now, and that's where his contemptuous term about moral orthopedics comes in. Now you've got a kind of like an apparatus that works silently to correct your posture, to correct your kind of moral posture. You've got a series of like disciplinary mechanisms that never show themselves in a way, that have no ostentation, that have no visibility. They're fundamentally insidious, surreptitious, and therefore require almost a kind of, maybe this is another reading of his term archaeology. I was going to say paleontology, in order to dig them up again, and so I don't know. Do you hear almost a kind of joy, in some of these descriptions? A weird.
No, I think
Like the way he savors them or something.
no, I think like personally, an avenue that I would like to avoid is the biographization or personalization of Foucault, his sexuality, his masochism, not just because it introduces a certain, or well, it has the potential to introduce a certain kind of moral inflection that can become a distraction.
Yeah, okay.
Um, but I think that the other reason is because those things are interesting to be talked of in and of themselves. And thirdly, I think that just as you kind of illuminated quite beautifully there, um, you can almost re-articulate it onto in a way that Foucault himself would enjoy, a kind of discursive plane of anonymity in which the text itself speaks. You know, the text itself speaks of the enjoyment.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
definitely, yeah.
the text itself holds those values without us having to hypothesize the person behind. And then I think the fourth reason is because something that one of the most important things to wrestle with, not just with Foucault, but you know, after we're finished with Foucault, but not forgotten, you know, we haven't, as Baudrillard might have liked, stuck him in the oubliette. You know, the idea is to go to Triple H plus one, right? Hobbes, Hume, Hegel, and then Marx. And I think that the thing that people really miss about Foucault, one of the most striking elements of his thought, is the way he attacks the lazy, thoughtless, everyday Sartreanism that is precisely the malady or cause of thoughtlessness and solipsism that we're trying to get away from. And it's something that I haven't yet managed to kind of wrestle with or get my way out of, which is, you know, to what extent are we at all in any way free from the conditions that determine, shape, force, influence, control us? You know, what does it mean, therefore, to be human or to be free? You know, and there's a line in one of the later lecture series of Foucault that we'll come to before almost doubling back and going to Hegel. You know, Hegel's idea, of course, being that we are basically at the mercy of these grand historical forces that there is nothing that we can do about. And Foucault talks about Hegel in a way that, you know, we have to get so close to Hegel. In order to get away from him, we have to get so close to him. And I think in a similar way, we have to do the same thing with Foucault. But getting close to Foucault is precisely not getting close to the person. You know, he despised that. It's getting close to this idea that, that we are made subject. There is no such thing as a personal experience, because the forms of experience that are possible are determinate of a particular era or age, which you kind of, you know, without making the connection that I am making, you know, you made that point in regard to snuff films and snuff videos and you know, the nature of them now as being taboo, whereas at a certain point they would have aroused a certain kind of fascination that you might describe as erotic. Now, I think it would be, again, a mistake, and I would agree with Foucault on this point, that it would be a mistake to kind of just take that age in which it evoked a fascination that bordered upon the erotic, because again, it has the risk of this moral inflection that can be distracting or difficult or problematic. But rather to think of, okay, well, what was that moment? And I think that kind of almost goes right back to, you know, where, or at least, you know, where my kind of cack-handed introduction into, you know, what I think we're doing or trying to get up to. You know, it's to create almost seminar for the damned as an escape from the hell of the present. But to escape from the present, we have to be able to approach it in a way that becomes, as Chomsky commented, I think it's the only insightful thing that came from that really famous debate between Chomsky and Foucault is that Foucault kind of terrified Chomsky, and the interviewer said why, and he said because he's a man who strikes me as completely amoral. And again, I have to refill my water, but I thought this might be a time, just because you were talking about Foucault's joy and his giddiness, and that's quite a contrast to the depiction in the Nouvel Observateur.
Yeah, all right.
So maybe you could read that passage, riff on it a little bit, and I'll just go and fill up my water jug. Because I've got, as my mum would say, a mouth like Gandhi's flip-flops.
All right.
Yeah?
Want me to read now?
Well, I mean, you can just sit and.
Oh man, I can't read to nobody. I'll
But,
wait
but,
for you to come back.
you have to when you write, do you write to nobody?
Yeah. Well, I do at the moment. Yeah. All right. Fuck it. When I read this thing, then. No, I can't do that.
Sticking out.
I did nothing. What I thought was interesting as well is like, in one of those lectures we just read, I think it's the third one, yeah, you have this idea of permanent punishment, but actually the joke, it's kind of almost like a kind of joke term, or a joke phrase, because actually the whole point about permanent punishment is that punishment never takes place. So it's continually in a sort of like preventative form. It forestalls, and how should I put it? Like second guesses where punishment is about to occur, and then prevents it in this kind of like embryonic form. And what I thought about that is it kind of like perfectly describes the disciplinary procedures of the school. So you have, like, for example, the thing we were riffing on the other day, you have this series of interdictions, a series of prohibitions that are actually not in themselves offences. They're not in themselves misdemeanors. They're not in themselves examples of naughtiness. But what they might do is create a space of germination in which, mischief or anarchy or rebelliousness might occur. So they are things like, okay, when you come into the classroom, go straight to your seats. Okay. So if someone dawdles in the middle of the class, especially if he dawdles at the door, he's immediately told off and given a warning. Now, no one thinks that taking slightly long to walk across the room is an offence or, some kind of act of rebellion. But nonetheless, it's precisely this form of like omnipresent preventative punishment. Again, if you're looking out the window, or if you're taking too long to get your stuff out from your bags, or taking too long to clear stuff away and put it back in your bags again, you're given a warning. Okay. So there's this constant, like, intervention at the level, not of real crime, not of real misdemeanor, but of like the conditions for imagining rebellion, the conditions for imagining a possible misdemeanor. I remember when we first spoke about this ages and ages ago, the way I tried to describe it was that they made mischief and rebellion and revolt boring. Okay, because who the hell wants to be like the guy who takes too long to get his stuff out from his bag? It's not like a mark of grandeur. It's not doesn't show you as especially kind of like a courageous or wonderful or inventive person. It's just dull. Yeah, And the kids kind of recognized that. And so it produces a general air of ennui, deflation, and devitalization in the class, in which, like in a kind of field that's been sort of like buggered and destroyed by, and like churned up by, those sort of like chemical enhancements such that you can't grow anything on it anymore. The classroom is a place in which no thought grows, no imaginativeness grows, because it's all been, you know, sterilized in advance by these measures of preventative uh, punishment or preemptive punishment. That's the better word, preemptive
Yeah,
punishment.
no, it's funny because as you were speaking that, and I was thinking of what I was going to kind of say in response. It was you kind of like articulated already, but I just have a slightly different vocabulary for.
Mm,
So it's the way in which punishment exists suspended in a kind of anticipatory state.
mm,
It's always anticipating the infraction rather than responding to the infraction itself. You know, so like the absurd matrices of transgressions or faults that now bedeck the walls of the contemporary school, and they're attached to a certain codification of value. Like I can imagine them almost being like a when you go into the school toilets, like on the the door while you're taking a shit.
well, they are there,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But then
I need to bring in like
the
articles of evidence next week, a
but then
series of.
the other thing, and it's very hard for me not to jump ahead of myself, ourself, and this project itself. But the other thing is, which is what you came to, the second aspect is that learning is in the conventional sense in which people understand it, right? Or at least some people. I mean, I hope. Learning becomes utterly displaced to precisely this kind of discipline. Like I locate it in almost a series, right? Obedience, submission, discipline, mimesis, repetition.
Mm,
And that's how the system of schooling, the university, even the system of peer review, the disciplinary system of peer review in science, has in its own way come to, in an anticipatory manner, kind of prevent any infraction, prevent anything, going out of bounds. But ultimately you can't. The nature of like Herodotus says, you cannot step into the same river twice. The world is always changing, and I think that the moment of crisis that we face now, this what I call the kind of hell of the present moment, which I don't even think is hyperbolic at all anymore. The British state is on the verge of collapse. America has just gone completely doolally. The scenario in Gaza and its reporting in the British media is just, on the one hand, it's completely explicable, but again, it exists in this anticipatory space of discipline, right? Where everyone who knows what's going on is appalled and abhorrent because it is a genocide. A genocide is happening in Israel right now, and no one on the news dare say it. And when someone does, when someone has the courage, and we will come to this later, of course, in which is what I'm talking about me, trying not to jump ahead of myself, on Foucault's
mm,
work on Pareitia and the courage of truth. When someone does have the courage to speak this truth out, it's immediately entangled, but not by an injunction, but rather by a kind of technicality or a triviality, or a condition that nowhere else would apply. So it's like people would have no problem with saying that there was genocide going on in, I don't know, like Darfur or
Mm.
Um, is it Bosnia or Serbia or I always get those places mixed up because of the quite tight historicity of the Balkan region. Um, but yeah, I think that's interesting. I also think that I think it's a good place to because I'm jumping ahead of myself, ourself, and this self, and so are you.
Mm.
So maybe I don't know if you have any, if anyone's bothered to.
Well, because you wanted to basically suspend and defer discussion of those other lectures till next week. Is that the idea?
Yeah, yeah, to
Wow.
listen this far, but to kind of just revert back to what I was hoping to achieve or begin to achieve for the first time. Um, with this seminar, which was to give a sense of what are we doing, why are we doing it, and why should you give a shit? You know, why should it be that you have to go and read something and think and consider and go through that process? What is the value of that compared to, I mean, I listen to the kind of philosophy podcasts that get all these views, and they're absolute crap.
Mm.
I mean, they're so dull and so banal. I mean, no wonder people use them to lull themselves to sleep. But even in that, kind of 15 minutes before nodding off, you get your Mr. Kipling cake for the day. But tomorrow you can go and say that you've learned something about, Jung or the self or transcendental meditation. I thought it might be a good point at which to kind of draw this seminar to a close, and maybe for you to
All
just offer some closing remarks because I think that, there were some things that we discussed beforehand that were quite interesting that
Shit,
you
what did I
haven't
say
really
beforehand?
articulated.
Yeah, what did I say? Um, oh yeah, you mean the stuff about like, well, yeah, in some way we can't be expected, and like nor should we ever become like the sort of salesman and mountebanks of our own ideas. So as to almost like we have to sort of put on a kind of fireworks display to momentarily distract you, whilst we kind of like sneak up like shysters behind you and slip a little nugget of wisdom in your back pocket. Like even if we could do that, even if we could be bothered to do that, you know, if I don't know, we're going to earn some money for it or something, the thing that you'd have in your back pocket would in fact not be a nugget of wisdom. You cannot receive the thing we're trying to give in, you know, 15 minutes of sound bites. It isn't receivable in that way. Like personally, we're not like, and ever since I was like young, I've done this. There have been periods of time where I've struggled with a masterpiece of philosophy, try to turn it this way, that way, read a paragraph, go away, try and read it again, try and like write down what I think what the guy was, Kant was banging on about, or what Hegel in his like, sort of like heaving, turgid prose with moments of like poetic respite was trying to get across. And that kind of, I don't want to sound like some sort of like, ascetic or killjoy, but or like some kind of like, colonel with a whip. But fundamentally, you do have to put in dedication, investment, and effort. Right? In that moment when you've got this passage of Kant and you're trying to, wrestle with it and understand it, something is happening to your mind. Like your mind is acquiring a new kind of like muscularity, a new kind of robustness, and also a new light-footedness and dexterity that you just, and if you're just not getting from those podcasts. The podcasts, you're sitting there and they're served up to you like fast food. There is no moment when you're working on yourself. There's no moment of ascesis. There's no moment where the soul has to kind of like readjust itself in order to enter through that particular gap. And that will happen and it won't be boring. It isn't just drudgery. It isn't just heavy lifting. That will happen in and through these seminars. And I feel that people, whilst they're doing it, especially whilst they're doing it, don't have to do it like away in some cubbyhole in the middle of nowhere, shut up in a kind of like monastic jail cell of solitary, study. But you're doing it in company with other people who actually are enthusiastic about this stuff, who's, can attest that life is better and more wonderful on the other side. And I imagine many people we're talking to have experiences of that anyway. And they've had an experience of reading Dostoevsky, and getting this kind of like moments of jouissance, enlightenment, and feeling that, okay, although partly they've been dragged through a hedge backwards. They've been tumbled down 10 slides, and they're full of like bruises and new like injuries in muscles they never knew they had. Nonetheless, there's also an elation after that experience. There's also a kind of rapture, and that it's like the health of the soul. And we want to offer nothing less than that. That may seem like extravagant, so grandiose, but you know, we've felt it so many times, both of us ourselves, independently and in each other's company, and we just think, well, the world would genuinely be better if we could collaborate and create a community, a more extended community of people willing to dedicate and devote themselves to that kind of study and intellectual labour. Is
Yeah,
that kind of what I said before?
yeah. No, no. I mean, I agree, and I guess I'd finish with. I mean, I'm going to finish with something uh quite hilarious. I'm just thinking about how you're going to see it. I'll be able to see it. But before that, no, no, I agree entirely. I think I think the only difficulty is there is a kind of gap, because when you haven't experienced those moments of joy and rapture, and when your experience has tended to solipsism, and in fact, often can increase one's sense of isolation and distance. It can be difficult to take that kind of leap of faith. But I think all that I would add is that for anyone who's got this far, you can probably see that me and Patrick will happily talk about these things until the end of our days. And we're going to be running this seminar whether people like it or not. And we're going to be doing it in this way whether people like it or not. And compared to, I don't know, a more banal pedagogy of taking a big work and deconstructing it and giving lectures and doing this kind of thing, I think following someone like Foucault, who himself is in this constant state of almost doubt, which it doesn't, it only comes through in his writing when you can see the wood and not the trees. He's engaged in this constant act of challenging himself against himself, and in and through that challenge, reconstituting himself. And that, of course, involves, you know, the whole gamut of emotion and experience that you know you kind of hinted at, and you know, involves moments of despair, sadness, loneliness, depression, but also happiness, rapture, joy, sublimity. And you know, things only exist in and through their difference. You know, so you can only get to those moments of joy, rapture, pleasure, you know, in and through the kind of struggle itself. And I think, you know, to go all the way back to that fairly poor but, you know, nonetheless adequate diagnostic of our moment that, you know, I began with, the primary form in which this takes place in the contemporary moment is in and through exercise or physical ordeals, you know, strongman challenges, marathons, exercise regimes, the perfection of the body. But I think to do so is not just vulgar and crass, it is also to deny our own humanity. It's very ironically, and to me quite hilariously, a turning in on oneself that turns one away from oneself. Whereas what we're trying to do is the exact opposite. We're trying to get people to turn away from themselves in order to be able to constitute themselves anew. And I think that is really the only mode of liberation that's possible. And yeah, and I'm not, you know, kind of dangling some, you know, carrot of liberation out. You know, some people are just going to be miserable and live miserable lives, and some people are going to be happy and live fulfilled lives. And but I think you know what we want to do is offer a chance or an opportunity, and you know, both of us, you know, you can look at our credentials and our experience, and we can be very confident in, you know, speaking to whoever is listening that what we envisage as happening in this space that we're only just beginning to create, kind of, you know, haphazardly, is just going to be far more satisfying, far more rewarding, far more enriching, far more empowering than anything that you're going to get from any institution or any university. And we're going to keep going at it, like it or not, and it's going to stay up there, and it's going to be online, and it's going to be for free. So, if you, Patrick, if I send you a link, I'm going to close the seminar with an absolutely
I love Monday.
hilarious video.
This is how I used a Google Pixel 9 to capture my adventures.
Sorry, I'm on the account that's not registered for. So I don't
You
know
can't
if
share things.
I don't know if YouTube will block this out, but if it does, we will soon enough be uploading the seminars to our own our own thing, so that we're not, you know, subject to the tyranny like we were last time. Anyone who watched the last one, it cuts out at a certain point, which is kind of ridiculous. But yeah, came across this the other day, and it is just one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen.
All right. Go on then.
So I'm going to switch away from us, Patrick, for the stream and
Right.
watch this, and then I'll just stop the stream and then I'll let you know. All right. Oh no! Oh no! It's the wrong one. It's the wrong one. It's this one. It's this one. Sorry. You see, haphazard. There you go.
The
I
coconut
can't see it.
nut is a giant nut. If you eat too much, you get very fat. Now, the coconut nut is a big, big nut, but this delicious nut is not a nut. It's the cocoa fruit. It's the cocoa fruit of the cocoa tree. From the cocoa palm family. There are so many uses of the coconut tree. You can build a big house for the family. All you need is to find a coconut man. If he cuts the tree, he gets the fruit free. It's the cocoa fruit. It's the cocoa fruit of the cocoa tree. From the cocoa palm family.
The coconut bark for the kitchen floor. If you save some of it, you can build a door. Now the coconut trunk, do not throw this junk. If you save some of it, you'll have a second floor.
The coconut wood, it is very good. It can stand 20 years if you pray it would. Now the coconut root, to tell you the truth, you can throw it or use it as firewood. Yeah.
Coconut leaves good shade it gives on the roof, on the walls, or against the eaves. And the coconut fruit, say my relatives, make good cannonballs against the thieves. It's the cocoa fruit. It's the cocoa fruit of the cocoa tree. Of the cocoa tree. From the cocoa palm family.
The coconut nut is a giant nut. If you eat too much, you get very fat. Now the coconut nut is a big, big nut, but this delicious nut is not a nut. The coconut nut is a giant nut. If you eat too much, you get very fat. Now the coconut nut is a big, big nut, but this delicious nut is not a nut. It is the cocoa fruit. It's the cocoa fruit of the cocoa tree. Of the cocoa tree. From the cocoa palm family. It is the cocoa fruit. It's the cocoa fruit of the cocoa tree. Of the cocoa tree. From the cocoa